Good, so I want to just dig into these couple of verses, and hopefully we'll have a bit of a structure, and try to keep it structured so I don't send you to sleep. And we'll look at what it is Jesus is saying, and ask a few questions, which hopefully will help us to apply that to our lives in the week ahead. It's an invitation from Jesus at the close of this busy period that's been going on through the last few chapters, as he's first been travelling around healing, and he's called the 12, and then there's been this whole interaction with the crowds and with messengers from John. And as he comes to a close of this talk, he issues this invitation. He says to the people around him, "Come to me, come to me." Sometimes people, I don't know if anyone said to you, Jesus never claimed, real authority for himself. He never claimed to be God. Perhaps it's just something that the Apostle John made up in his gospel. When you read Matthew's gospel, or any gospel, you can see again and again that Jesus is claiming a sort of authority that only God has. And we'll see that as we go through this invitation. But also he's claiming to be the answer to our needs in a way that only God can be. So first of all, we're going to look at who the invitation is for, because I think we'll find the invitation is probably for us. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden." Jesus doesn't restrict this to certain types of people who are labouring at certain things or heavy laden in certain ways, but he says to the crowds around him and to the disciples around him and to the messengers from John and everyone else who's around him, he says to them, if you're weary, if you're labouring, if you're heavy laden, this is an invitation for you, come to me. He's not speaking specifically only to his disciples or only to those who've not yet accepted him or only to those who are opposing him, but they're all here together and he's issuing them this invitation. Now the context obviously of the invitation is he's already explained to them that not everyone is going to come. No one can come to him except those whom the Son has chosen to reveal the Father to. It's been hidden from the wise and understanding, revealed to little children. But in that context, he simply says to everyone, well, here's the invitation then. If you are labouring and if you're heavy laden, then come. If you're labouring, if you're worn out with toil, you've been toiling hard, it's worn you down, you feel really worn out at the end of the day, this invitation's for you. So if you're laden down like the camel that the last straw is going to go on its back and it's going to break, you're heavy laden, loaded up with anxieties or worries or issues or whatever it is, this invitation's for you. The people around Jesus had lots of reasons in their lives, just like we do today, to feel weary, to feel like they've been toiling a lot, to be laden down with anxieties or worries or anything else. They were probably largely people who had very tiring manual jobs for a start. In those days, you remember Jesus' parable about the labourers who were hanging around in the marketplace all day, and it gets to the 11th hour, and he goes out and brings in the last ones who've been standing there all day, because they're working 12-hour days. You work a 12-hour shift, 6 days a week, and that's fairly normal, and then you get 1 day a week off, and that's your working life. If you're a wife who's at home looking after the kids, you're not just looking after the kids, you are making the clothes and baking the bread and everything else that we kind of take for granted you buy in Tesco's today. You've got a hard-working and a very busy lifestyle. There's other reasons that you're going to be very busy and feel like you're not getting much rest. Even on the Sabbath, as you can see in the beginning of chapter 12, you're being dogged by the religious leaders who are checking up on your every move. Ooh, did you just pick a piece of corn there? And did you eat it? We'd better make a complaint. Even on the Sabbath, you've got these leaders of the people, the Pharisees, who are raising complaints and monitoring everything. And if you read on into chapter 12, ensuring that you don't get healed on the Sabbath. You've got lots of reasons to feel like you're labouring and heavy laden. Even on the few holidays you get off a year and you go to the feast in Jerusalem, you don't drive there quickly in a car, you walk there over several days. Again, it's dominated by the religious leaders who are laying down the law, making sure you don't transgress any of the extra things they've added on, and make sure that you stay within their boundaries. And even around Jesus, there's lots of reasons why you might feel particularly tired and heavy laden and labouring. Jesus' disciples that he's called, they have a big job to do. Jesus is starting to send them out throughout the whole nation of Israel, and they're going to travel from place to place in pairs, just two of them going into a town, and with the job and the commission of telling everyone there that the kingdom of heaven has come and healing the diseases of the people in that place. You find later on, when they return from that trip, that they've been working so hard and it's been so busy, they don't even have time to eat properly. And that's, of course, the occasion where Jesus says to them, "Come apart and rest a while." And they think, "This is great, let's have a rest." They get there, and there's 5,000 people plus waiting for them. And Jesus says, "Right, now you give them something to eat." And they're running around trying to feed these 5,000 people and trying to work out how to do it. The Son of Man, as Jesus said, has nowhere to lay his head. Peter goes out in his boat. He toils all night trying to catch his fish. Then he's sitting on the beach washing his nets. And Jesus says, "Right, go back out into the deep, put down your nets for a catch." And he says, "We've toiled all night, we've caught nothing. But if you command, then we'll take out the nets." Paul, as we were looking at in the letter to the Thessalonians, he talks about how he and Silas and Timothy, they worked night and day when they had those 3 weeks in Thessalonica, preaching the message to the people. These people have got lots of reasons, haven't they, to feel like they are labouring and heavy laden. And on top of that, they've got the religious leaders pushing the demands of the law. On top of that, they know their own sin. As Peter said to Jesus, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man, O Lord." They're labouring and they're heavy laden. What have you been labouring at this week? What's made you feel really weary? You get to the end of the day and you think, "Whew, this has been a really tough day. Because I've been working really hard at this. That's been a real worry. This has been a real anxiety. There's this problem or that problem." Have a think. Think to yourself, what have you been labouring at? Well, the good thing is that Jesus says, if you are labouring or if you're heavy laden, then he's inviting you to come to him because he's got something that you need. He's got something that you need. So what is on offer? The second thing. What's on offer? Jesus says simply, he says, "I will give you rest. I will give you rest." Now that's kind of what you're most hoping for, probably, if you're in that situation, right? It's like a day off would be a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be lovely just to be able to sit down and not have to do anything for a bit? Yeah, I will give you a rest. Now, we'll look a bit at what that rest looks like as we go through the rest of what Jesus says. But the important thing, first of all, is that this isn't something that Jesus is coming up with as some kind of new offer. It's like, you've had everything that you read about in the Old Testament, and there's been all these other things. I think it would do you good to have a rest, and I will give you some rest. What he's doing is he's claiming to be the God who gives rest. And he's referring back to Exodus chapter 33. Just read what happened back in Exodus chapter 33. As the people came out of Egypt, where of course they've been working 7 days a week and it'd be even tougher, they came out of the land of Egypt in the wilderness on their way to the promised land, and God is going with them and showing them the way and promising to be with them. And in Exodus 33, the people have gone right off track. And they made themselves a golden calf and worshipped it and put it in the place of God. But this is what God says to Moses. Exodus 33 verse 12. Moses says to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name. and you've also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you, in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people. And he, that is the Lord, said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And Moses says to the Lord, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Moses is afraid that they will be left by God. They've certainly turned their backs on him. God says to him, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And this is what Jesus is identifying with here in Matthew 11. He says, come to me. Come to me. Here I am present with you. Come to me, and I will give you rest. The rest that you still haven't found. They've now entered into the promised land. They're there where God had promised to give them. They're no longer wandering in the wilderness. Come to me and I will give you rest, Jesus says. And there's probably three really important things about this. First of all, that rest is a gift. It's given. It's something that's given specifically by God. Rest is a gift. God does, of course, he gives us rest on a daily basis. As Solomon says back in Psalm 127, God gives sleep to those he loves. David says in Psalm 3 and Psalm 4, he says, I lay down and slept, I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. He says, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. God gives rest each night, he gives sleep to those he loves. God has given us rest each weekend. That's what we've been enjoying today, isn't it? And going on into the beginning of chapter 12, Jesus makes the point, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who's given that rest for us each week. And it doesn't give us this in Matthew's Gospel. In Mark, Jesus says specifically that Sabbath has been made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's not that here is a rule and you're fitting into it, but here's a gift from God to you. A day in the week on which you can focus on resting rather than on working. God gave rests to his people each year. As I said, they had the feasts 3 times a year. They would all go to Jerusalem. You'd have the Feast of Tabernacles, where they had a whole week dedicated to rejoicing and to camping out in a tabernacle. And I'm sure it was great fun for the kids. And to worshipping God together. And that was one of their holidays, effectively, where they would leave behind the farm and the 12-hour shifts per day and spend time rejoicing and resting together. God gave that on a daily, a weekly, an annual cycle, times to rest. And God, of course, gave the people rest in their inheritance, as Moses was looking forward to there in the wilderness. But that rest can only be found ultimately in God's presence. And that's the point that Moses is making as he pleads with God not to leave them. Now, God has said back at the beginning of Exodus 33, when directly after they've made the golden calf, the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? They've got a land flowing with milk and honey. It's the one that God promised them. God's going to drive out everyone else, and they can have it for themselves. But it's a disaster, isn't it? Because God says, I will not go up among you. And it says in verse 4, the people heard this disastrous word, and they mourned. They at least got one thing right. They'd realized that nothing, certainly not the golden calf, and not an angel either, could take the place of God. And so when God says to Moses, 10 verses later, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest, they now have the hope of the rest they actually need. Now, the problem they have in Matthew's time, as Matthew's writing this and as Jesus is speaking, is that they have the land. They are there. There's milk and honey in plenty. Yes, there's the Romans, but they're there. But at the same time, they don't have rest because they've turned away from God's presence. And so Jesus says to them, as God, he says, come to me and I will give you rest. Rest requires God's presence. Rest is a gift. It requires God's presence. Because if you're going to rest, then you need to have someone over you, don't you? Someone who's going to lead you, someone who's going to manage you, someone who's going to look after your accountabilities for you, someone who you trust, who's going to lead you. If you, I don't know if anyone here has ever started up their own business, but the business I work in, I know the people who started it and founded it. I've worked for them for many years, and I can tell by looking at their lives, it's not a restful occupation to be your own boss. It's not a restful occupation to be your own boss. Jesus here is saying, and God here is saying in Exodus, he's saying, I will go with you. I'll be your boss. I'll be the one that you can trust. I'll be the one who leads you, the one whom you serve, the one who points out the way to you. And that's going to be how you have rest. So rest is a gift. Rest requires God being with you. And rest is then a gift that requires faith to accept. If you're going to rest, you need to trust that someone else is looking after things for you. It was good to go on holiday a couple of weeks ago, and for the first couple of days, my mind was going, everything is going wrong at work. I'm sure everything is falling to bits. And then the guy I'd left it with messaged me and said, everything is fine. I've set up these meetings. It's all going really well, so it's brilliant. Okay, I've got someone I can trust. He'll get on with things, and I can actually rest for a bit. Now, what we have here is something even better, because it's not someone that you're delegating to rest for you from time to time, so you can rest from time to time, but someone who's over you, who is constantly in control, has constantly got it in hand, so that you can rest all the time, because you know that he is looking after you. Rest and faith are very closely related, aren't they? If you won't rest, it's probably because you don't have faith. Okay, you're not really trusting God for something. If you are saying to yourself, well, I need to make sure that I'm doing every single thing to look after this. That's why God has commanded rest, and why the Sabbath was such a big thing as the people came out of the land of Egypt. They needed to learn to trust God. And when the manna came down 6 days a week, they needed to trust that what God said was true and that they could actually afford to rest on the seventh day. And a load of them didn't trust God, and they came out on the seventh day and began frantically hunting around for manna because they thought, I don't think I've had enough left over from yesterday, even though God had promised that they would. If we're going to trust in God, then we're going to rest. If we're going to be able to rest and actually rest, then we need to have someone to trust in. Isaiah says in Isaiah 30, verse 15, as he's pointing out the problem with the people in the nation of Israel in his day, I'm just going to read Isaiah 30:15. He says to them, thus said the Lord, Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength. But you were unwilling, and you said, no, we will flee upon horses, and we'll ride upon swift steeds. They're putting together all their plans about how they are going to escape from the Assyrian invaders. And they're really worried. They're rushing around like headless chickens, going, there's the Assyrians. First of all, we have the Syrians and the Israelites. Now the Assyrians are on their way. They're ruthless people. They're conquering everyone in sight. What are we going to do? God's saying, trust me and I will rescue you. They're going, no, we need a plan for this. And they are rushing around trying to acquire some swift horses so that they can escape from the incoming Assyrians. And God says to them, rest and trust, because I've told you what you need to be doing. And I've told you what's going to happen. So rest is a gift, and is God's presence and his faith. And what really destroys rest at the end of the day is trying to be God of your own life, isn't it? If you feel like everything depends on you, that you are the one that the world depends on to make things happen, then you are going to kill yourself with work, aren't you? One sort of work or another. Whether you think that your righteousness depends on you following all these commands, you're going to kill yourself with work. If you feel like the provision for your family depends on you working every day of the week, all sorts of hours in order to earn enough money, you're going to kill yourself with work. If you feel like your place in serving God depends on how much work you've done, you're going to kill yourself with work. That's kind of the point that Solomon's making back in Psalm 127, isn't it? God gives his loved ones rest. Unless the Lord builds the house, you're labouring in vain to build it. Jesus says back in Matthew chapter 6, this is, I guess, some of examples of things you might be heavy laden with. Matthew 6, verse 25, he says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you'll drink, nor about your body, what you'll put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" He's saying, you could be really anxious about everything, couldn't you? You've got a lot of needs as a human being. You need to eat, you need to drink, you need to something to wear, you need somewhere to stay, etc., etc. But who is it who cares for the birds? God does. And they seem to get by without worrying about where their food or their drink or their clothes or anything are coming from. If God cares for them, he's going to care for you too. So what's on offer here is rest. It's rest from God, because God can be trusted as your Lord and your Master. And therefore, if you are going to trust him and have faith in him, you're going to rest in line with what he says. Stop trying to be God of your life. What do you go to when you need a rest? When you need to escape from the rat race or the turmoil of whatever's going on, where do you go to? Yeah, all sorts of things flourish, don't they, when you are labouring and heavy laden. That's where addictions flourish, and often sin and covetousness, which is idolatry. They all flourish when you're labouring and heavy laden and you are trying to be God of your life. Or if you invite something else to be God of your life. It's very easy to turn to something else for stimulation or comfort, or just to get away from the things which are causing you anxiety or to be exhausted, instead of going back to trusting and resting in Jesus. So what's on offer is rest. And then just thirdly, well, what are we invited to do by Jesus? Well, he says simply, first of all, doesn't he? He says, "Come to me." It's a statement of immense authority and power. He's saying, the rest that God gives will come to me, and it's here. It's here. Don't go anywhere else. Don't go to the temple. Don't go to the synagogue. Don't go to the Pharisees. Don't go to the altar and make your sacrifices. Come to me. That's where you're going to find rest. And he says, do two things. He says, take my yoke on you. And then he says, learn from me. Take my yoke, Jesus says. By his yoke, he's talking about his service. His service. Take him as your master. Sometimes, obviously, a yoke has a couple of uses. It's basically something used for carrying burdens. You can put it on an animal. You also put it on a servant. Anyone who's doing a lot of manual work in those days needs a yoke to enable them to carry a certain amount of stuff with them, because they don't have cars or pickup trucks or anything like that. I think the point here is less the animal. I've heard people say that Jesus is saying, I'm one ox, come and be the other ox. I don't think that's the point here when you look at the context. He's not saying, come and join me in taking the Father's yoke. He's saying, come and take my yoke. Come take my yoke. Own me as your master. Be my slave. Be my servant. enter into my service. Enter into my service as your king, as your Lord. Because he is the one to whom all things have been handed over. All things, he says, have been handed over to me by my Father. He is the one who is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one who is God, present with us to give rest. He's going to be a very different master from Solomon. Solomon, for all that he wrote, Psalm 127, he wasn't a good master, and neither was his son. You find 1 Kings, I won't turn to it now, 1 Kings 12 verse 4. The people come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, when he's made king, and they say, Solomon put a very hard yoke on us. They say, make his yoke easier. Yeah, make your yoke easier than Solomon's was. Yeah, we were his servants, it was really difficult. Now be a good master. And Rehoboam, of course, comes back and says, I'm going to be a worse master. Solomon's yoke was heavy, my yoke will be heavier, is the words that he uses. In Jeremiah chapter 28, God uses this picture of a yoke to illustrate what's happening as the people come under the rule of the Babylonian Empire, and specifically of King Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 12. Jeremiah has been going around wearing a yoke to show the people, and actually as well the ambassadors of the other nations coming into Jerusalem, that they need to submit to and serve King Nebuchadnezzar. And this other false prophet has broken the yoke and said to the people, don't worry, it won't happen. And this is what God says to Jeremiah. Sometime after the prophet Hananiah had broken the yoke bars from off the neck of Jeremiah the prophet, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, go tell Hananiah, thus says the Lord, you have broken wooden bars, but you have made in their place bars of iron. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I've put upon the neck of all these nations an iron yoke to serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And they shall serve him, for I've given to him even the beasts of the field. But Jesus' yoke is not like that. It's certainly not like Nebuchadnezzar's. Neither is it like the yoke of Solomon or Rehoboam. What does Jesus say about his service? He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So be my servant, and you will have a light and easy and a pleasurable service. Neither is Jesus' service like serving the religion of the Pharisees and the other Jewish religious leaders of the day. In Acts 15, James describes how the Jews feel using these terms as well. So Acts 15, verse 10. He says, now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? He's speaking about them trying to force the Gentiles to be circumcised and to go through all the Jewish ceremonial laws. He says that was a heavy yoke. We've not been able to bear that. They're not going to be able to either. Let them bear Jesus' yoke instead. Jesus' yoke is easy. His burden is light. I'm going to read again from Isaiah chapter 58, verse 6, where Isaiah talks about the problems with a formal religion and religious hypocrisy. Religion that isn't based on what God says or in trust in Jesus. Isaiah 58, verse 6, he says, is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Yeah, people have been claiming in their religious zeal that the rules and the things they're putting in place are by doing that, they're serving God. And in that situation, they have these fasts where they are insisting on everyone fasting, and they're humbling themselves and do all these religious outward observances. And Isaiah says, why don't you actually try giving people easier yokes or breaking their yokes instead? Well, this is what Jesus is doing. He's saying, I'm breaking the yokes of the other religious leaders. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. In what ways have you been showing that you are wearing Jesus' yoke this week? How do you show that he's the one that you're serving? Do you appreciate the easiness and the lightness of serving him rather than serving someone else? Serving yourself can be a very heavy yoke, can't it? Serving a false religion which says, do these things and maybe God would be pleased with you, is a very heavy yoke. Jesus' yoke, his yoke of his love and his sacrifice for us so that we can learn to serve him, is an easy and light yoke. But Jesus says as well, he says, learn from me. Don't just take on my yoke, take on my service, but learn from me as well. Jesus is the one who is Lord and Master of the Sabbath. He's the one who invented rest. God rested on the seventh day. He's the one who invented it, who designed it, who gave it to man as a good thing. And he says, learn from me. Learn from him as a gentle teacher. He says, I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Real rest, which goes a lot deeper than just lying in your bed for 10 minutes. Rest where you can go, my worries and my concerns and my issues, I know who has them in control. The things that I am aiming for and striving for, I know who has that in his keeping. Learn from him as the gentle teacher, and learn from him as the lowly example. As you read through the Gospels, you see how Jesus rested and trusted in his Father's will and his Father's purpose and his Father's commands for him. It's great to keep going back through the Gospels. That's the way that we're going to learn from Jesus. We have Jesus' words and Jesus' life and Jesus' character laid out for us. The more that we see that, the more that we'll be able to rest in him, because we'll learn from him. As our teacher, we'll learn to rest. As our example, we'll learn to rest. Learn from Jesus to rest in him by, as we said, accepting rest as a gift from God, trusting him, and finding it in God's presence with us. What have you learnt from Jesus this week? What have you learnt from him? If you're struggling to think, what have I been learning from Jesus? You probably need to spend more time with him in his word, reading his word, thinking about his word, praying to him, asking for his help, asking for his help to understand his word, but also bringing your issues and your troubles and your problems and your work and everything else to him. So rest is on offer, and you're invited to take on Jesus' yoke and to learn from him. And trusting in him, you can enter that rest. So I want to finish with a few words from Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews 3 and 4 is a passage about rest, which is really learning the lessons from the people of Israel. We started off with God's word to Moses and how God said to them, I will give you rest, my presence will go with you. But of course they never really experienced that rest as they should. The writer of the Hebrews picks this up, and he picks up on the fact that they were unable to enter God's rest. As he quotes from the Psalms, that God swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And they were unable to enter, he says in chapter 3, verse 19, because of unbelief. They didn't really trust God. They didn't really trust God. And even when their descendants entered the promised land, very soon they forgot him, and they forgot to trust him. But the writer says this, he says, 4 verse 1, therefore while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Yes, there's resting from your works in trusting him. In chapter 4, verse 9 to 10, he says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. But there's also a striving, the writer says, to rest increasingly in him, and to look forward to the day when our learning from him and our trust in him and our resting in him is complete. So let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Because people, and we can, look for rest in all sorts of places, but at the end of the day we're only going to find it in one, aren't we? Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."